What's going on, everyone? It's Ben from YGF from Zero, back with another retro Yu-Gi-Oh video, and this will be a video hoping to sort of introduce you to Treasure format, which is the next format that I'm going to be covering on the channel. Now, this format shares the same card pool as the previous format that I've been covering, MRL format, but it has a new updated limited list that attempts to make the game a lot less sort of toxic and just dependent on all the hand rip cards. So whether it succeeds or not is up for debate, but this does make for a new format that is quite different from MRL format before it, despite sharing the same card pool. Because there are sort of no new cards added to the card pool, this will be a shorter guide than my last guide. If you are interested in me discussing all the various cards released in Magic Ruler, then definitely check out the MRL format guide as I go into major depth about which cards are good, which cards aren't, and which cards are just unplayable completely. Given that I've covered the card pool in another video, and also given that this format is very underexplored, this guide will be a bit shorter than the guides usually are, but I still hope it will be informative and get you interested in trying out this cool format for yourself. But before we dive into that, if you're not already subscribed to my channel, please subscribe. At the time of recording, we're around 370 subscribers. I'd really like to reach 400 by the end of the month. It would be a major milestone to hit to start the year off right, and also it would greatly help out the channel. In addition, if you aren't aware of our Discord server, we have a Discord server now. Link will be in the description below, but it's a great place to sort of find other people willing to play these sort of very obscure and underplayed formats, and willing to sort of test out what the best decks in those are. So if you're interested in experimenting with this format for yourself, definitely check it out. And lastly, if you enjoy this video, as always, please leave a like down below. But with that out of the way, let's talk about this new limited list. So in October 2002, they released this new limited list that hit a lot of the big problematic cards introduced by Magic Ruler. First, starting with the monsters, we've got Cyberjar. Now, Cyberjar was basically the central focal point of the mill deck in the previous format, which was basically a deck that tried to take advantage of 3 Cyberjar and things like Spear Cretin to have your opponent draw a bunch of cards and then activate multiple card destructions to deplete their deck. I think that mill deck still is very good in this format, and it's still very playable, but I think that this hit makes sense to make it a bit less powerful. For the other limited monsters, it's just the piece of Exodia, which were already limited up to this point. And for the next couple spells, we've got the Power 5 limited spells that have been limited ever since Yu-Gi Kaiba format. So Change of Heart, Darkhold, Monster Reborn, Pot of Greed, and Raigeki. Nothing new there. The new spells on this list are very important though, and they start off with Confiscation, Delinquent Duo, and the Forceful Sentry. Now, these 3 hand rip cards were collectively known as the 3 Sacred Treasures in the OCG, which is why I decided to name this format Treasure format, as these cards are still very powerful in this format and very format defining. Each of these cards depletes your opponent's hand in some way, and Forceful Sentry and Confiscation give you hand knowledge. Delinquent Duo is the only one that's a +1, but honestly all 3 of these are just incredibly strong, so I think limiting these is the correct choice here. And so these are something that you will have to play around in the format. However, I will say that in MRL format, having all of these unlimited made it so that pretty much every game when you were playing decks that had a bunch of hand rips in them, every game would turn into a low resource game at some point, so the advantage would sort of equalize very quickly. With each of these limited, if one player draws them and the other doesn't, it can be a major uphill battle for that player to sort of claw their way back into the game, which can make these cards a bit more sacky. However, I think in order to have a format that's a bit more sane than MRL format was, I think that limiting these is the correct choice here. So for people who were interested in the new cards that Magic Ruler introduced, but were sort of turned off by all the hand rips being unlimited, Treasure format could be the format for you. The other spells I think are also pretty good hits. We've got Painful Choice, which, to be honest, if this was still at 3 copies, I'm not sure most decks would play it at 3 copies, especially now that the hand rips are now limited. But it's probably better safe than sorry to bring this down to 1 copy. I think it's a decent card in the format. I'm not sure every deck would want to play it, but the decks that do can take major advantage of it. And it's just a great card, it basically replaces itself with a card that is likely to be strictly better in whatever situation you're in, and can also deck thin as well. So very powerful card, very tricky card to use, but if you use it correctly, it can pay major dividends. Next up, we've got Snatch Steal, which I think is another great limit. Having 3 of this card in the format basically adds the 3 additional Change of Hearts to your deck and can enable decks to get aggressive out of nowhere. You know, Snap Steal on its own does that as well, but just having 1 copy is a lot more manageable and a very good limit in my opinion. And lastly, we have Upstart Goblin, which may seem a bit weird as it's not really in the same power level as the other cards in the format, but having 3 of this would make it so that people could essentially play 37 card decks, and given the increase in powerful spells in this format, I think that that's not a very good idea, so I think that it's very good to limit this down to 1 copy. Whether decks will actually play this or not is another matter. It does slim the deck down by 1, but life points do matter a lot more in an old format like this, and honestly, just slimming the deck down by 1 card might not be worth it, but, you know, it's here if you want it. And that's actually going to be the last change to this limited list. You know, there's still only 1 limited trap, Mirror Force. The semi-limits are exactly the same, 2 Sangan, 2 Witch, 2 Card Destruction, 2 Heavy Storm, and 2 Swords. So, you know, the major changes to the list only really happened in the limits, and I do think that that's necessary as really the problem cards introduced by Magic Ruler were too strong to be semi-limited. So they gotta be limited here, and they are. So what does this mean for the format as a whole? Well, I think overall it doesn't really affect the viability of most cards that I talked about in MRL format as being good. Like, I think the only one it really majorly hampers is Electric Snake, which when you had 3 duos in your deck made a bit more sense, but here is a bit more iffy. So I think that every other card I discussed in my MRL format guide is pretty much at the same level of playability as it was then. If there are any other cards that are majorly decreased in power level or majorly increased in power level, please let me know. But I think that the main effect of these limits on the format will actually be to enable more jank decks to be more viable. And the reason for this is that jank decks often rely on having multiple cards to sort of synergize together. For instance, if you've got a ritual deck, then you need to have a ritual monster and a ritual spell in hand, as well as material to actually tribute off for that ritual spell in order to bring out the ritual monster onto the field. With the hand rip cards, you know, it's very unlikely that you'd actually be able to keep that amount of cards in hand for any period of time. So I think that limiting the hand rip cards makes strategies like that a lot more viable, and that is the main draw of this format, I think. I think that the decks that were powerful in the previous format are still powerful here and might even be a bit more powerful. But all these new jank decks really add a lot of interesting elements to the format and make it much more diverse. Now, we haven't really experimented too much with this format in the Discord. We've played a couple games, but we haven't really gotten into the weeds, so it's unclear where exactly all these decks fall in terms of power levels. But that's something to explore in the near future. So I just mentioned the jank strategies, so let's just talk about a couple of them that I think are a lot more viable in Treasure format than they were in MRL format. Now, this section probably won't even scratch the surface of all the jank you could potentially play in this format, but these are just sort of 4 decks that I've seen been talked about and sort of experimented with in these preliminary stages of the format, and have looked pretty decent to me, or at least a lot more decent than they did in MRL format. The first of which is Relinquish. Now, I think this deck is really sick. It's basically the only viable ritual deck, in my opinion. The others can be okay, I guess, but they cost too many resources to bring out essentially what amount to big beat sticks. Relinquish, on the other hand, costs less resources to bring out as it's only a level 1 ritual monster, and also it has a killer effect on top of that that can turn it into very much a sort of control strategy, or even a sort of like burn strategy as well. Now, I already discussed all the supporting cards for rituals in the MRL format guide, so I'm not going to get into all those there. But suffice it to say, Relinquish's effect to suck up an opponent's monster and remove it in a very interesting way that also can potentially give you a big beat stick on your side of the field that's hard to sort of destroy by battle can be very strong. So I'm looking forward to seeing what people do with this in the format, and I'm looking forward to trying my own hand at it. The other major sort of jank deck that I think Magic Ruler introduced that might have some potential here is Toons. Now, Toons are in a bit of a weird situation because they can get a lot of monsters on field very quickly if Toon rolls out, but they sort of suffer from actually pressing that advantage that they have to wait a turn to attack. And they are also very fragile, given that any spell and trap removal on a Toon world will then clear your entire field. All that being said, I think the deck does have some potential, and there are some interesting synergies that can help shore up its weaknesses a little bit. Things like Giant Trunade can both clear the way for your tunes and also get Toon World back into your hand and prevent your opponent from destroying it, thus clearing your field. Things like Soul Exchange are great in this deck, as it does have a fair amount of tribute monsters that, can't attack anyways when you summon them out. So that could be very good as well. I'm not sure the deck will ever, sort of break into tier 1 or maybe even tier 2, but it could be a potential rogue option to explore, and I'm excited to see what people do with it. But there are also some older Jank strategies that also get a shot in the arm with this new limited list, Clown Control being one of the chief among them. Now, I tried out Clown Control a little bit in MRL format. I didn't make a video on it because I didn't find it to be very good. But the main issues with that deck in MRL format was that it was really bad in top deck mode, and oftentimes you would wind up in top deck mode if your opponent used a bunch of hand rips on you. Now that the hand rips are limited, I think this sort of controlling deck can really shine, and it did get some major tools to help it out. Giant Rat is a recruiter that can bring out Dream Clown in attack mode at the end of your opponent's battle phase, and enable you to get a Dream Clown pop basically the next turn. Messenger of Peace, while not the best floodgate around, is still a floodgate that can protect your clowns. There are just a lot of very interesting synergies that can come about from the clown control strategy, so I think it does have some major potential here. So I'm excited to see how it develops in the future, and I'm excited to try my hand at it as well. Lastly, I think Harpies actually has a lot of potential in this format. Being able to search out a Harpy Lady with Flying Kamakiri #1 is very good, and also using a field spell like Rising Air Current can greatly increase the damage threshold on your big OTK pushes. So I think that Harpies has a lot of potential. I think it's a sleeper hit in Critter format, and I think it will be a sleeper hit here as well. So those are some of the more jank strategies that I think do have some major legs in this format, so look forward to seeing them in some of the upcoming videos that I've got planned. But while jank is a bit more viable this format, I think that the best decks in the format are largely the same as what they were in MRL format, with some slight differences, so let's cover those. I think that making a deck with just good stuff is still pretty good in this format. I'm not sure that my particular build of it is entirely optimized. I just sort of quickly adjusted the build that I had from MRL format to meet the standards of the new limited list. But I think that just putting all the good cards in the format together into one deck is still going to be a good recipe for a very powerful deck. Is it tier 0 like I said it was in MRL format? I don't necessarily think so, but I think it still is very threatening. I'm not going to go through the card by card here, as, I'm planning on making a video about it. And also, this build is definitely not 100% what you should be playing. There's plenty of room for personal choices and customization with this sort of deck, but the deck is still out there. So if you're looking for a good introductory deck to start out with the format, I think this is a good one. And also if you're playing a jank deck, you need to sort of be mindful that this sort of just good stuff deck is in the format, and you've got to have ways to deal with it. But there are also some much more interesting decks that I think are very good and potentially better than they were in MRL format. So let's cover those now. Now, Mill did lose 2 of its Cyber Jars, but honestly, I think the Mill deck in Treasure format might be better than in MRL format. And that may seem crazy, but the fact that your opponent doesn't have as many hand rip cards does greatly help you set up your board in combos. And it also makes things like Magic Jammer much more likely to be live, as you'll probably have more cards in hand than you did in MRL format. Now, yes, we did lose 2 of our Cyber Jars, which is very unfortunate, but these can be easily replaced with something like Hero's Shadow Scout, which is honestly a card that we maybe should have been playing in the MRL format mill deck as well. I've tested out this deck a couple times, and it's been killer, so I think this deck is a major power player in this format potentially, and potentially even a tier 1 deck, so it's definitely something to watch out for. Again, I'm not going to go through the card by card here, as I do have a video coming out soon that will be about this deck, so look forward to that. But this deck is fairly degenerate and it's fairly powerful, so it's something that you've got to be mindful of. Speaking of degenerate and powerful, there's another sort of deck like this that is also very good this format. Burn is also just incredibly good in this format, in my opinion. I mean, this list in front of you here is almost the same as the Burn list that I featured in MRL format. I just swapped around some of the hand rip cards, but this deck is really, really sick and really, really degenerate. And I think it's very, very powerful, and I think it's arguably more powerful here than it was in MRL format, because just like with the mill deck, you know, your opponent doesn't have as many hand rips to disrupt your combo before you even get them on the field. So I think this deck is very good. I think that it could potentially be optimized. I'm less confident in this build of it as I am in the build of the mill deck, but I think it's still a deck to very much experiment with and very much be afraid of, as it is very strong. However, I've got a whole additional video devoted to this coming up, just like with the mill deck, so you can look forward to that if you want to see this deck in action and get a more in-depth card-by-card analysis of it. But I think that Good Stuff, Mill, and Burn are probably going to be my picks for what the tier 1 of this format is shaping up to look like. Now, I could definitely be wrong. I might be overestimating some of these decks or underestimating other decks. But just in my brief experimentation, these decks have felt very, very powerful and very, very strong. And so I think these decks are the decks to beat. Now I could go on for even longer, covering more jank ideas that you could do, like potentially equip aggro, or analyzing each individual card in this format and how it's, you know, sort of grown stronger or grown weaker from the limited list. But I think hopefully this should be enough to whet your appetite for diving into this format, and also should be informative enough to get you started if you want to try it out. If you have any questions about it, please let me know down in the comments below. And if you do want to actually play it for yourself, the link to the Discord is in the description below, so we'd love to have you. We'd love to play some games with you. But this video is going to start my exploration into treasure format, and I'm really looking forward to it. I think it will be a very fun format. So I hope that you all will enjoy it as well. But until next time, I've been Ben from YGO from Zero, and I'm signing off.